Yes, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV and to our continuing coverage of the 2025 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. Yes, thanks for coming back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and as you know, we're currently in the process of continuing to edit all of the footage that we filmed at this year's 2025 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and we've got quite a lot of stuff still to get through, so there's quite a few episodes still to come. So if you haven't already subscribed, then now is certainly the time to do that. But let's press on with our next batch of motorcycles, and this of course is episode 4. Okay, so thanks for coming back as we continue with our coverage of this year's 2025 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. And in this episode 4, we're going to continue looking at some of the bikes from early Saturday morning, where I was lucky enough to grab a few bikes just before the Telford International Centre opened its doors to the general public for day one of the show. And so we're going to start by checking out this beautiful 1966 BSA Victor Grand Prix, which is a bike that's been a year in the making, and this fine specimen here was put together by Trevor Prix, who's already got quite a nice pair of John hand-built 4-stroke road taxis in his workshop, and Trevor told me that he's looking forward to putting this bike on the track this year and racing it in the Prix 68 class at local vintage scramble events. Now, with regards to this bike's background, there wasn't really much to tell other than when Trevor first bought the bike, the chassis was already chrome plated, which is, I think, different to the original Grand Prix BSAs of 66, which I'm pretty sure were all originally black when they were first built. But Trevor said that the chrome on the frame was in such good condition it would have been a bit of a crime to have it all removed and the chassis put back to its stock BSA black. Anyhow, for 1966, these BSAs still carried the motor's engine oil in the front of the frame, and it was usually filled through this little filler cap there just in front of the gas tank. But as I remember, I think BSA produced these GP B44 Victors to celebrate Jeff Smith's iconic World Championship title win the year before. And it's said that 3 models were made by BSA in that year. The Victor 441 GP, the Victor 441 Enduro, and the Victor 441 Roadster, which I think was later called the Shooting Star. But all 3 models were very popular sellers in that year. And as we move on to the Victor B44 4-stroke engine, which in our case, I'm assuming that Trevor has done a total rebuild on this motor when he was doing the restoration. But for a simple British-built 4-stroker, this power plant here was a little belter. And if my aging memory is still intact and functioning as it should, I'm pretty sure that these B44 Victors had a 4-speed transmission and a pretty basic oil-cooled wet multi-plate clutch. But essentially it was a decent engine, which I think pumped out around the 30 odd horsepower range, and at the peak of their production. They reckon that around 500 of these GPs were produced during 1966, and as I recall, they were then discontinued about a year later. Now, Trevor never actually told me or listed everything that had been done to this GP Victor engine, so I'm unable to say if this is just a stock standard B44 motor or if maybe Trevor's had some upgrades done on it. But even in their original factory configuration, this 4-stroke BSA power plant was a reasonably good engine for 1966. But as we move on to the front end of the BSA Victor, it was a quite basic set of BSA forks, which I suppose for their time worked okay, considering that these were just simple oil-filled dampers with external springs that had these quite nice chrome-plated covers to hide them and protect them from the elements. But it never ceased to amaze me just how all of those legendary British scrambles racers of that period could go so fast on these bikes with this basic of suspension setups here on the front, although I suppose that there was very little in the way of an alternative, so I expect that these guys just had to do their best and get on with what they had. But on the other hand, here at the rear of our Victor GP, the story was much the same, with what more than likely would have been just another simple pair of girdling dampers, or maybe something similar that was used to keep this back end of the bike in line, because those guys, of course, never had the suspension technology or even the manufacturing processes our off-roaders enjoy today with regards modern shocks and forks on our dirt bikes. So they must have been made of quite strong stuff back in the 1960s when all of those British scrambles racers at that time were looked upon as the sports stars of their day. Nevertheless, also in those golden days of the 1960s, steel and chrome were still king when it came to making wheels for motorcycles, and it was still these steel wheels with their chrome coatings that were used even on these scrambles bikes, because they'd yet to move into the era where weight was the governing body on these scramblers, when things like fiberglass and alloy were used to quite good effect. Although we still had a nice pair of alloy mudguards here on the front and at the rear of our BSA, which again was quite typical of that time period, but it wouldn't be too long before we then got into the age of plastic, which would set out the parameters for off-road components in the future. Although, having said that, one of the more prominent features of these Victor GPs was this quite nicely sculpted alloy fuel tank that had the kind of two-tone paint job on it, with that rear part just being left in polished alloy and the front in this nice bright yellow with the red BSA logo there on the side, which immediately identified it as one of these iconic Victors. And with regards its fuel capacity, I'm pretty sure it was just under the 2-gallon mark, or something like maybe 1.8 litres or so, but it was usually enough to keep our B44 motor fed with its fuel on even the longest of those old school winter scrambles events. Although there was one final little piece of trivia that I do remember about these old Victor GP fuel tanks, and that was, as I just mentioned, there were around 500 of these Victor GPs made at the time, and you could even get the legendary Jeff Smith himself to autograph each and every one, which, as I remember, I think Jeff got paid about £1 for every tank that he signed. So if your GP Victor tank has Jeff Smith's signature on it, then you'll know that he almost definitely got paid his pound for his signature services. Now, once again, comfort wasn't really a factor when it came to the seats on these old BSA scramblers back in 1966, and you'd think that with that limited suspension movement at the front and at the rear, then maybe a deeper, plusher seat would certainly help towards protecting the rider's crown jewels when he was getting pounded by those rough, bumpy British racetracks of the 60s. So, as you can imagine, more evidence of just how tough and hard these guys were to do those long scrambles races when more often than not they do their very best to use the seat as little as possible, although when you look at the seat from the side view, it almost looks like it's been a bit of an afterthought to fit it to the chassis. But this is exactly how they came in 1966, with this 4-inch gap between the seat and the back of the fuel tank. Now, in these couple of pictures here that Trevor supplied with the bike's information, you can see just what sort of condition it was in when Trevor first bought it, with most of the important bits all intact, but with, of course, the wrong seat and a few other non-original parts. And as I mentioned, even Trevor's not that sure of this bike's history, and if anybody recognises it in this kind of state, then maybe they could get in touch just to try and help him out. But anyhow, I'm not going to dwell too much on Trevor's BSE Victor too long in this clip, because I do intend to do a much more in-depth review of this bike once we can recover a bit more of the BSA's history. But again, Trevor's done a fantastic job of restoring this old iconic British classic, and I'm certainly looking forward to learning a little bit more of its past life and its history. Now, you may remember in episode 1 from Telford, we did say that we'd return to take a look at more of the nice bikes that were on the Greaves Riders Association stand, and this time round it's Chris Dakin's 1968 MX4 360 Greaves Challenger, which is another immaculately prepared classic from that 1960s era. So once again, we've got another nice example of one of these early Greaves scramblers, which once more is a typical example of the very same bikes that the likes of Dave Bickers and Alan Clough and many of the other British scramble stars of their day used at those old winter scrambles events that we'd watch live on the telly in the 1960s. However, this particular example, as you can see, has obviously undergone a complete restoration or refurbishment by its owner, Chris Dakin, who's again made a fantastic job of presenting this bike at Telford this year. And I'm pretty sure that when the Greaves company first put this bike together in 1968, it still never looked this good, even when it was sitting on the dealership floors awaiting a sale. But again, and as in our previous Greaves bikes, these Challengers, of course, had the all-alloy I-beam front down tube as part of the front of the chassis, and by using the Greaves engine as a kind of stressed member to bolt both that I-beam alloy part of the frame and the rear tubular subframe together as one unit. So our Greaves power plant, as you know, is a two-stroke piston port single cylinder engine, but it has this twin exhaust ports which are much like some of the old Czechoslovakian CZ bikes of that same era. So those twin header pipes came out of the barrel, and then they connected onto a kind of collector box underneath the engine, which then led onto just a single tailpipe that ran down the right hand side of the bike. Although Chris's bike is almost definitely a show item, because I don't think that these pipes have seen much dirt actions since the bike was built. And those twin header pipes are quite a prominent feature on many of these Greaves motors. But you can see that our Challenger has these leading link banana style front forks, which although they may look like they wouldn't be much cope on an off-road scrambles bike, these leading link forks actually worked very well in practice, and to sort out some of those rough, bumpy racetracks that these bikes raced on at the time, it was a simple pair of dampers that were used on this front end. But as we make our way onto the back end of Chris's Challenger, it's not, of course, the old Girlings or 1960s type dampers that Greaves fitted in 1968. It looks like he's swapped those for a much more modern pair of what looks like it could be maybe a set of rock shocks, which are basically a more modern interpretation of the originals that Greaves fitted. But these ones here are, of course, made of much better quality components, and will make our Greaves handle a lot better than it would have done with those old school original dampers. But nevertheless, you can see that fiberglass was still being used to manufacture the fuel tanks and things like the side panels on these old Greaves bikes. And as in the previous examples that we took a look at in episode 1, you could have these tanks all done up in all manner of exotic colours, like metal flake blue, or maybe even gold, or even this quite nice red here that we have on Chris's machine. But because these tanks were super lightweight, they were relatively easy to produce in quite large numbers once the original moulds were made. So compared to an equivalent alloy or maybe steel tank, then these fiberglass items certainly helped to keep the overall weight of the bike down to a decent level. Although the one thing I will say is that each and every year that I've returned to Telford, the Greaves Riders Association always just seem to go that extra mile when it comes to their array of Greaves classics that they showcase each year. And yet again, they've done the business with these super high quality old classics. And if you remember the other two Challengers and the Griffin examples from episode 1, then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So when it comes to top quality shiny bikes, then there's no question at all that the Greaves Riders Association are the kings of bling. Although, on the other hand, if we take a look at Chris's other Greaves, which is a 1967 364 cc model, complete with all of its original parts, and of course the original mud and detritus that it's picked up at its last classic scramble. So I suspect that Chris just wanted everybody to see exactly what one of these old Greaves scramblers looked like in the wild prior to it being jet washed and cleaned and then spit and polished to make it ready for the Telford show. So certainly a sharp contrast from all of those immaculately prepped Greaves examples that we looked at earlier. Although I have to say that you almost never ever get bikes turning up at Telford in this kind of raw original post-race condition, but I have to say that there's something really refreshing about seeing an old vintage dirt bike in this kind of state, because although the biggest percentage of the bikes that were in the Telford halls have had many hours of polish and elbow grease and other work lavished on them to make them look their absolute best on the day, the surprising thing was that, believe it or not, this bike here was actually getting about the same amount of attention as some of the other super shiny bikes that were in the halls. And I don't think it's because there was anything really special about this vintage Greaves. I think the whole aspect of just seeing the bike that wasn't all shiny and in its raw post racing state was something that intrigued the audience and the passing punters so much that I think this mucky classic was having its picture taking just about as much as some of the other cleaner examples. So you have to say a big well done to Chris for having the foresight to give the Telford paying public something slightly different at this year's dirt bike show, although I'm not actually sure who did the clean-up on this part of the stand after the bike was wheeled away, but hopefully by the time you're watching this clip, Chris has now treated the bike to a well-deserved wash and brush up. Now, this was another quite nice British classic that I spotted on my Telford walkabout, and this reproduction twin shocker CCM is another belter of a bike that was built by Keith Barnes. Now, Keith's big CCM's not a fully original Alan Clues bike from the 1970s, although to be fair, the engine and quite a few of the other parts are certainly the real deal from that era, but that quite nicely crafted chrome-plated chassis is another hand-built replica from Joe Maxwell Engineering in Dumfries in Scotland. And Joe builds these reproduction frames for not only the 79 bikes, but for the 1974 and the old 350cc trial bikes that CCM made back in 1978. But we'll certainly take a look at Joe Maxwell's JME display in a later episode in this series. Now, I'm sure you already know that almost all of these CCMs were powered by the big BSA B50 four-stroke engine, and Alan Clues certainly worked his magic on these big thumper engines, because when Alan Clues bought out what was left of the BSA's competition department back in the early 1970s, BSA wouldn't give Alan any access to the works engines, so Alan did what any other entrepreneur would do. He just simply took the old BSA B50 road bike engine and then retuned it for more power. And of course, as you know, the rest is history. Although Keith's certainly no stranger to all things CCM, he's certainly one of those fanatics that lives and breathes all things Alan Clues, and in the past Keith's built some fantastic looking bikes, and we're going to be taking a look at his latest CCM creation in a later episode in this Telford 2025 series. But when it comes to aesthetic looks, there's certainly nothing to beat these CCMs with their chrome-plated chassis and, of course, this gold-coloured alloy fuel tank, and join those parts with some nice gold wheels and Preston Petty mudguards and other parts like a stylish seat in this B50 engine. Then you have one of the best looking four-stroke racers of the 1970s. But just to finish off our episode 4 from Telford, we're going to take a quick look at a pair of beautiful Kawasaki's from Steve Coughlin Racing, who's another good contact if you need your old worn out classic brought back to life. And this featured 1983 B2 KX 125 is just one of Steve's recent projects. But a quick resume of this KX's background is that this is another bike that Steve has restored for Jason Huffy, who was another very talented rider from a way back in the day. And Jason, I remember, told Steve that he had many great memories of when he was lining up on the start line alongside stars like Kurt Nickel, who at that time was just a young works rider on an SR 125 Kawasaki for Team Green, which I think at that time was run by Alec Wright. Anyhow, it was Jason who approached Steve at this Telford show back in 2024, and he showed him these pictures of his old KX and asked if Steve would be interested in taking on the job of bringing back his old KX 125 to life. And as you can see from Steve's pictures, this little KX was in a bit of a sorry state, but after a long process of refurbishing and just trying to locate original parts from around the globe, Steve eventually managed to get the job done only 2 days before this 2025 Telford show was about to begin. So as you can see, Steve had quite a job on his hands to get this bike finished in under 12 months, and that was alongside all of the other projects that he had on the go, but finish it he did, and this is the finished product. A better than new 1983 B2 Kawasaki that's now race ready for the track. Now, I'm not that sure that the bike's owner Jason has actually seen this bike in its finished state, and if he's not seen it as yet, then I'm pretty sure that he's going to be well impressed with exactly how it's turned out. However, as you can imagine, new old stock parts for these 83 B2s aren't exactly freely available these days, and it was the bike's owner Jason who spent many hours phoning and messaging people around the globe just to try and help Steve locate all the proper original parts that he needed to put the bike back to its 1983 condition. And the original KX bits and pieces were found in other countries like Australia and South Africa and even Germany, just to name a few. But it's certainly suffice to say that this liquid-cooled KX motor has had the full strip down and rebuild in Steve's workshop, and every single component, nut, bolt and washer have been put back to its as new 1983 showroom specification. But we're not going to spend too much time here on our 125 in this particular clip, because this KX and another that we are about to show you are two bikes from Steve Coughlin that we're going to do a full length feature on soon here on my channel, because Steve's supplied some quite nice pictures of both of the bike's restorations. So we're going to give you the short version here in this clip. So that was just the first of two Kawasaki's that Steve Coughlin Racing had on his display at Telford for 2025. So if we take a look at the other bike that Steve had on his stand, this was the Kawasaki that Steve Coughlin had worked his magic on again, and this 1981 KX 250 is another customer's bike that Steve has restored, and is actually from the same person who owned that immaculate Michael that we showed you on Steve's stand from Telford back in 2024. And this KX here originally came from Phoenix Motors as a US import way back in 2019, and Steve's instructions were much the same as per the 125, to undertake a full restoration and have it as good as, if not better than it was when new in 1981. And so, as you can see, as in our previous 125, each and every component on this 250's engine was given the complete Steve Coughlin Racing resto treatment, and this particular KX is now just about as good and probably better than it was back in 1981. And once again, here at the back, it was Kawasaki's all-alloy Unitrack swing arm and rear suspension setup, and all of the parts and the fasteners on our 250 were all original, new, old stock components, because Steve, whenever humanly possible, always endeavours to try and fit original parts onto his restorations, although of course there are times when you just can't, because off-the-shelf parts are just sometimes no longer available, which brings us on to the KX's fuel tank, which for 1981 would have been made from plastic, of course, and despite Steve buying 3 second-hand ones with a view to restoring at least one of them, all 3 were still scrapped because they just weren't good enough. And so there was only really one solution, and that was to use one of Steve's contacts, who was called Claudio Venezuelan in Italy, to make a replica tank. But rather than try and do it with plastic, Claudio made a replica works style tank out of alloy, which then of course had to be painted, and that part of the tank's restoration was entrusted to C&G Autos, who made a fantastic job of matching the colour and the KX's graphics. So although this wasn't the original plastic tank, it was an absolute perfect copy of the 81 item, and certainly not cheap to construct either, as you'd expect. Although I must say that guys like Steve and many of the other classic motorcycle restorers up and down the country who provide owners and riders with their resto services are certainly worth their weight in gold when you see the quality of their workmanship that they turn out. And as I said I've already seen quite a few examples of Steve's skills, and if you're a regular viewer to my CDB TV channel, then you may recall that immaculate 1988 RM250 Suzuki that Steve had on his display at last year's Telford show. And as I said, this is just a short version of Steve Coughlin's tale of two KXs, because as I said, we will do a full feature on both this 250 and his 125 at a later date, because we've also been supplied with some nice pictures of the build of both bikes by Steve, so we've got enough material in there to make another video, so look out for that. But if you're maybe in the market just to get your old tired dirt racers brought back to life, then why not take the time and visit Steve's website for all of the details that you'll need. Right, so these are just a few of the bikes that are coming up in part 5 from the Telford 2025 show, which are, I think we're only about halfway through at this stage in the programme, so if you don't want to miss out on any future episodes from this year's show, then just simply subscribe to my channel and join the already 20,000 satisfied customers. So for the time being, thanks a lot for watching, and until we get around to posting episode 5, it's cheerio for now.